share across to them.
Now, you're a practicing Catholic, the most senior Catholic in the land, Archbishop Vincent Nichols. He's attacked your reforms. He says they're becoming more and more punitive. Punitive to the most vulnerable in the land. What do you say?
I don't agree. I don't agree with him on this. It would be good if actually he'd called me before he made these attacks, because most of the facts they put in were incorrect. Disposable income, for example, at the moment is at its highest level it's been for a long time. And for the poorest 10% in society, they're now spending, as a proportion of their income, less than they did before on food, and that's because disposable income has improved. So, you know, the reality is I'm not quite sure what he thinks welfare is about. Welfare is about improving and stabilising people, but most of all making sure that households can achieve what they need through work. Let me give you an example. You know, the number of workless households under previous governments rose consistently. It has fallen for the first time in 30 years by nearly 18%. So it's something in the order of 250,000 children that were growing up in workless households are now in households with work, and they are 3 times more likely to grow up with work than would have been if they had been in workless households.
Well, let me come on to something that he may have had in mind as being punitive. Let me turn to some of the housing benefit changes. And a year ago, the Prime Minister announced that people with severely disabled children would be exempt from the changes. But that was only after your department fought a high court battle for a family whose children couldn't share a bedroom because of severe disabilities. Isn't that what the Archbishop means by punitive, or some may describe it, heartless?
No, we actually made that decision. We were originally going to appeal it, and I said no. I think it's reasonable to
Why did you fight it
make
in the
the
first
change.
place?
Well, the standard you put up for an appeal, but I said no.
We were talking about families with disabled children.
Well, there are good reasons for this. I said that for children in difficulty like that, they don't make the decisions about their household; their parents do. So I said we will exempt them. But for adults with disabilities, the courts have upheld all of our positions on this against much of the complaints. So my point about this is, but it's very important.
But you did appeal it, Minister. It's just that you didn't then go, having lost in the appeal court, you didn't then go to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, but, you know, you make decisions about this. My view is it was the right thing to do to exempt them at that time. And these are multiple decisions. But no, he didn't at all. I made that decision, not the Prime Minister. The reality is that, let me just get this right though, the context of this is quite important. Housing benefit under the last government doubled in the last 10 years from 11 billion to 20 billion. It was set to rise to another 25 billion. It's the fastest rising of the benefits. It was out of control. We had to get into control. It's not easy, but we haven't actually cut the overall rise in housing. We've lowered it, but we haven't cut housing benefit. And we've tried to do it carefully so that people actually get a fair crack here. And I've got to say, on the spare room subsidy, which is what this complaint was about, the reality here is that there are 250,000 people living in overcrowded accommodation. The last government has left us with 1 million people on a waiting list for housing, and yet there were 500,000 people sitting in houses where they had spare bedrooms they weren't using. Now, you know, as we build more houses, yes, we need more, but the reality is councils and others have got to use their accommodation carefully so that they actually improve the lot of those who are living in desperate situations in overcrowded accommodation, and taxpayers are making a lot of money. Now, so this will actually help people get back to work. They're more likely to go to work, and they're more likely, therefore, to end up in the right sort of housing. And that's important. That reform is
right. All right, you've had a fair, I mean, we've not got much time left. But a centre-right think tank that you've been associated with on Jobseeker's allowance says that 70,000 Jobseeker's benefits were withdrawn unfairly. And Dominic Penna wants to know, are these reforms, again, too harsh and punitive?
First of all, those figures are not correct. But
the Policy Exchange is wrong.
Those figures they were using were not actually correct, and we'll be publishing corrected figures on this. But the reality is that what they're referring to...
How many then were?
They're referring to... I've got the figures, they'll come.
So some people have lost their Jobseeker benefits. They've been forced to go to food banks, and they shouldn't have.
No, they're not. What he actually is referring to is that we allow an advisor to make a decision if somebody is not cooperating. Now, here's the rules around Jobseeker's allowance. We now make them sign a contract. That you've signed a contract, you agree these things, these are things we do for you. At the end of it, we have to, if you don't do any of those things, then you are likely to have your benefit withdrawn on Jobseeker's allowance.
But now, some of this was unfairly withdrawn.
Well, you know, there are many, many more. There are millions of these things that go through. This is a very small subset.
But if you lose your Jobseeker benefit unfairly, of course, your cash flow
but there's an
is
immediate,
shot to hell.
No, but Andrew, there is an immediate review within 7 days of that decision within 7 days, that decision is reviewed.
On the breadline.
But, you know, they're immediately able to get a hardship fund straight away if there is a problem. We have nearly £1 billion set up to help people through crisis loans, hardship funds, support, etc., and in many other ways. We use that finance. We've given 200+ million to local authorities to do face-to-face checks. You know, this is not a nasty, vicious system. This is a system that says, look, we ask you to do certain things. Taxpayers pay this money. You are out of work, but you have some obligations to seek work. What we simply ask is that you stick to doing those. Those sanctions are there for people who will not cooperate. And I think it's only fair to say to them, look, this is a choice you make. You make choices all through your life. If you choose not to cooperate, then this is what happens.
Is child poverty rising?
No, child poverty is actually falling. It had fallen in the last figures. But
can I show you these figures?
The 300,000 that actually fell in the last.
There. These are from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which Westminster regards as...
Well, that's a projection by Institute of Fiscal Studies.
But it also shows that it's gone up every year and will rise by 400,000 in this Parliament under your government, and will continue to rise, projection. But never mind the projection, because you say that's a projection. It may
that's
be
a projection
right,
based on if nothing else changes.
But it will be 400,000 up when this Parliament ends compared to what you inherited.
Well, that's
child
what their
poverty
projection
is rising.
Well, that's their projection. We'll see where we are.
No, that's not a projection. That's the actual figures.
No, the point is that
to 2013,
the last figures, but the last figures that have been gained show that child poverty has fallen by some 300,000. Now, the important point is, can I just finish this point off? Child poverty is measured against 60% of median income.
Yes.
Okay, so this is an issue about how we measure child poverty as well.
You wanted to change the measurement.
Well, we have been discussing publicly with her. No, I made the decision not to publish our change figures at this particular point because we've still got a little more work to do on them. But, you know, there is a big consensus that the way we measure child poverty right now does not measure exactly what requires to be done. For example, you know, a family with an individual, a parent who may be drug addicted, who gets what we think is enough money to be just over the line, their children may well be living in poverty, but they won't be measured. So the reality here is we need to get a measurement that looks at poverty in terms of how people live, not just in terms of the income levels that they have.
You can see from that chart, 400,000 rise in child poverty by the end of this Parliament, why you'd want to change the definition.
No,
you're presiding over an increase.
I want to change it because under the last government that set it, child poverty rose consistently from 2004, and they ended up chucking, yes, but they ended up chucking huge sums of money into things like tax credits. Let me give you an example. In tax credits, in 6 years before the last election, the last government spent £175 billion chasing the poverty target, and they didn't achieve what they set out to achieve. We don't want to continue down that line where you simply put money into a welfare system to alter a marginal income line, which doesn't make any sense.
I understand.
So that's why we want to change it, not because some projection says you might be going up.
Right. Well, but as I point out again, it's not a projection up to 13, 14. But I put one final point to you, because again and again you say it's your mission to make work pay, that people will be better off if they work rather than living on welfare. But more people in poverty are now in working families than in workless. For them, work is not paying.
Let me just deal with those figures for a second. Those figures refer to the last government's time in government. What was interesting about it was, up until 2010, under the last government, those in working families, poverty in working families, rose by 500,000, about 1%. Actually, for the 2 years up to the end of those figures, it's been flat under this government. Now, the only point I make about this, first of all, so these are figures at the last government's
you inherited and haven't changed.
Yeah, right. Hold on a second. This is important. You know, the truth is, even if you are in poverty in a working family, your children, if they're in workless families, are 3 times more likely to be out of work and to suffer real hardship. So in other words, moving people up the scale into work and then on into higher hours is important. The problem under the last government system with working tax credits is it locked them into certain hours and they didn't progress. What we're doing now is changing that so that you progress on up, so that you go out of poverty through work and up beyond it. But those figures you're referring to actually refer to the last government's tenure, and there, as I said, they spent £175 billion on a tax credit which still left people in work in poverty.
Secretary of State